Welcome to the Flight Club Podcast, a woman's guide to leaning out. We give you a behind-the-scenes look at business launch and growth through the stories of successful female entrepreneurs. Here's your host, Felina Hansen, founder and CEO of Hera Hub.
Hello and welcome. I am excited to share my conversation with Liz Lemesevski. She has spent over 20 years working on Wall Street, investing other people's money to build wealth. And she finally decided in 2009 that she was done with that, and she officially leaned out of the corporate world. And she found a company called Money Native, specifically to help small business owners achieve their long-term goals by focusing on their business finances. And I have to say, we see a few business owners that kind of bury their head in the sand a little bit as it relates to money and their finances. So I'm excited about this conversation. And Liz, I'm excited to share your story. Welcome to the show.
Thanks. Glad to be here, Felina.
Fantastic. Well, let's get the story behind the entrepreneur here. Tell us about you. Tell us, where, I know you're from the East Coast. Tell us exactly where, talk about where you went to school, and then let's wander along your career path.
Thanks. Okay. Well, I am the youngest of 7. And I grew up in a small town, about 200 people in Cornerstown, New Jersey, it's called. So it's a very rural place in New Jersey, which is surprising. And, now I think about it, how suburban we are. Back then it took 50 minutes to travel anywhere. And this is before, obviously, the internet and before cheap phone service, because even to call my friends, it would cost money to call across town, and that was so anyway, I spent a lot of time on my own. Even though I was the youngest of 7, most of my older siblings were brothers. So actually it was a really nice place to grow up, because I could walk in the woods by myself and I was not afraid of anything. You could ride my bike 6 miles, so I was very independent. So I went to high school at the regular public high school, Allentown, and I was really, really glad to get going to Rutgers for college. And I was surprised at how unprepared I was academically for college. I had to take, preparation for pre-calculus. So, math was actually not anything I was interested in, but it was something I had to do because I really wanted to be a business major. So I also was really, half of me is very right-brained, and then, the other half is kind of forced left brain. So I was a French and finance major, actually.
Wow.
And I remember when I did take calculus, I had to study for 4 hours a day just to get my homework done. And I got a great tutor who helped me. His name was Bar Von Osen. And with his help, I got a B in the class, which was a big deal because at Rutgers, they made it a point that they fail half of the people who take calculus. So why I talk about that is because those things that I learned in calculus and statistics, they really helped me in my money path, like understanding, like I wouldn't be able to solve a calculus problem again, but the concept of what's the change, what's the magnitude, what's the acceleration, those are really big concepts for me.
Yeah.
So after school, my first job was on 180 Maiden Lane in New York City. So that was called Philadelphia International Bank. Now, why there was something called Philadelphia International Bank is kind of funny, but it had to do with a law called the EDGE Act. And so what I did there was international customer service. So I dealt with, and this is again before really the internet. So we had to deal with like telexes that we would get from Australia, New Zealand. I also dealt with Indonesia, all those little islands like Vanuatu and the Solomon Islands, figuring out what happened to their money transfers. So I was customer service, and I found out just a lot of interesting things, like how still in India at the time, the back offices of the banks still had like chickens running around them, and all the paperwork was done on parchment paper.
Oh my God.
And there were no computers at all, so that was super interesting. And another big thing about working there is the woman who ran it did a diversity program, and it was interesting because there was a large, it was very diverse culture. There was a lot of African Americans, Caribbeans, Indians, then some white people, and I remember distinctly going into the conference room. And, being kind of, I was like 22 years old, going into a conference room, having a conversation about diversity and having my, head spin, realizing how biased I was, basically. So they had given me this, the African Americans in the group gave me this article called Unpacking the White Knapsack. And it really, hit home, like things like being an African American and being in a store, you're going to be questioned whether or not you can pay for something. If you have the things. And at the time it was, you couldn't, and I still think it's true, like you can't hail a cab and have the cab slow down. So it made me realize even though I came from this small town and I grew up with like no money, it made me realize that the privilege that I had just by the color of my skin. So that was really eye-opening. So, but from there, I worked at Citibank, and I worked on what was called the secondary loan trading desk. So it's the first time in the United States that this kind of trading desk was set up. And so what it was is that it was the first time corporate loans started to be traded. So what does that mean? It means like Walt Disney would borrow $5 billion, and a bunch of banks would get together and lend them the $5 billion. But then they decide, well, loans last for about 5 years. And they'd say, well, we don't want to own that loan anymore. The interest rate's not high enough, or there's a lot of reasons why. I mean, a lot of things around what I've found around finance, it's about structure. It's like building a building, of trying to figure out what floor does what, and or even you could think of it as a cash waterfall. Like, what cash do you need, and when do you need that cash? And so you create this, funnel to make sure that the cash, the water runs. I'm trying to see if that makes sense to you.
Yeah, no, it does. Yeah, no, I definitely, and I can understand what you're saying of this structure and access to capital and getting things on or off your books. I think probably where people might start to relate to this, and at least from an information perspective, is what happened with the housing crisis, right? And not, maybe this isn't the best parallel, but we heard about home loans being bundled together and sold, off, right? And sometimes the package of loans would have some decent loans in them, and sometimes they'd have some bad loans in them, and they got people to buy these package of loans because, certain rating agencies were, sort of looking the other way, but we won't get into too far into that. But
that's a good point, because when I got to Citibank, I was on the real, so it was a secondary loan trading, but it was also, I was juggling something with the commercial real estate.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was given a box when I got there and said, this guy left 6 months ago. This is what he did. Figure it out.
Mm.
So one of my first jobs was, this was at the time during the commercial real estate crisis
Yep.
in New York City. And the Japanese had come in and bought a lot of buildings, and now that the cash flows from the mortgages couldn't support the loans.
Mm.
So the loans were defaulting left and right, and all these legal fees were piling up. And then I went out and I contacted all the banks and collected the legal fees. And I actually won an award for it. And I was like, wow, this doesn't seem to be a big deal, but okay. I guess it was a big deal. No one was doing it. And so because no one was paying, if no one asks you for the money, it's just like in a small business. If you're not asking your customer, if you're not sending them an invoice, they're not going to pay you.
Sure.
So that happens at big places too. And so I was looking through my little files. I have this file called Favorite Clippings, and one was a congratulations letter from Citibank for working on the Plaza Hotel. And that was the deal where I met Donald Trump. That was when we took the hotel away from him.
Oh.
And yeah, and so I had forgotten about doing that deal too, and we all won an award for doing our work on that, as well as other properties around New York.
Oh my gosh, interesting.
But yeah, so you see that, so at Citibank I lasted, I didn't see any path. I didn't have my graduate degree at the time, and I worked from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. And then they would send a limo if you worked to 8 p.m. they would send a limo to take you home, which actually was a pretty nice perk considering I lived in Hoboken, so it was nice to get driven home. And so I left there to go work at a hedge fund, and people were like, well, why are you leaving Citibank and going to a hedge fund? Well, the hedge fund was paying me twice the amount of money that I was making at Citibank, and he paid for my grad school.
Mm-hmm.
So I went to Fordham University at night to get my MBA. So I did that for 2.5 years, and then it was just the two of us managing. There were 4 people total, 2 not here, but in the United States, in New York City, and then 2 in Monaco. So basically we managed mostly, it was $100 million total, and then 90 million was wealthy Swiss individuals, and it was managed in the Cayman Islands.
I see.
So basically we had a mailbox in the Cayman Islands. It was very common. Yeah. And the law was for Swiss people that if they made money outside of Switzerland, they wouldn't be taxed on it.
I see.
So if you say that the money is held in the Cayman Islands, at a bank in the Cayman Islands, then there's no tax from the United States.
Or in their home country. Right.
In either in Switzerland or, and there was even one guy, I think it was before I was there, but he was very wealthy, and he would travel from country to country, not claiming any citizenship because he didn't want to pay any taxes.
Great.
So he lived at hotels. And we had another guy who spent half the year in Vail and half in San Pedro Island. He skied during the winter, and then during the summers he would go windsurfing.
Very nice.
But what was interesting about that, it's another kind of, how we were talking about secondary loan trading. This was bankruptcy investing, which would mean that if a company, generally what we did is we invested in the senior most secured assets of a company if they were going through bankruptcy. And the banks didn't, most banks, they called it, most banks are white shoe, meaning they don't want to deal with any of that stuff that you have to negotiate about and fight over.
Okay.
And a term for it was actually vulture investing.
Yeah, yeah.
So as the vulture, we would go in and take and negotiate with the company of like, okay, who gets paid what? You know, how much is this company worth? Am I going to take stock instead of when the company comes out of bankruptcy, will I convert my debt into stock and see how that goes? So probably one of the most famous ones was the way it even got started was because of Macy's when it was federated, and they did a big LBO. Yeah, that was the first time something major like that happened, and the vultures made a ton of money out of it. And you know, it gets a really negative, the negative bent, like vulture investing.
Sure.
But it made me see, like, well, what does go wrong in corporations? What happens to businesses? You know, and they used to call it good company, bad balance sheet. But what I realized, you know, so you think about it is a lot of times with small businesses, they talk about how they're undercapitalized.
Yep.
But a lot of times too, it has to do with like really what are your sales, and you know, how are you balancing them with your assets, and are you even able to, you know, because a lot of times when you're dealing with, my specialty has always been dealing with companies that don't really have that strong of an asset base. They just have the cash that comes in from sales.
Okay.
So, so I stayed there for 5 years, and it was really pretty fascinating, but also it was just, you know, obviously no career growth because there was only 4 of us and it wasn't growing.
Yeah.
And so I got my MBA, and then I started looking for jobs on the West Coast because my partner, Rose, at the time, her mother was getting older and having some dementia, and she wanted to be out here with her. So I actually landed the only job in high yield bonds, basically in San Diego County, or maybe one of 4 jobs. So because no one knew anything about it, you know, like there were a lot of people that specialized in. So I worked for 8 years at a place called Nicholas Applegate, and now it's called Allianz Global Investors, and that was managing. When I talk about, you know, managing money for other people, I kind of compare it to when I was little, my mother told me that my Aunt Ethel was a dressmaker. And I said, oh, well, maybe she could make me a dress. And she says, no, she's not that kind of dressmaker. She works in a factory, and she just puts on the left sleeve of the dress. So she'd know how to, you know, make you a left sleeve, but not the entire dress. So that's what high yield investing is about, is that someone comes in and says, you know, I have this whole dress that I want to have, but I'm going to farm it out. So you do the left sleeve, high yield, and then equity, you do the right sleeve. And in the middle, I'm going to do treasury bonds and also maybe some alternative investing.
Got it. To create a balanced portfolio. Is that the goal?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, it's going back to cash flows. Well, like, what cash flows do you need?
Yeah.
How much risk are you willing to take? So high yield bonds are typically supposed to be more risky, and then they have a higher, a lower credit rating from Moody's or S&P.
Got it. Yeah.
And they have a lower rating because they have a higher risk because of their business model.
Got it. And just to be clear, a bond is debt, correct?
Yes, a bond is debt. So what it is it's debt that is usually issued for 10 years. A high yield bond would be 10 years. And so when you ever hear about the concept of duration in bonds, if you ever hear about that, that really applies to treasury bonds and maybe bigger corporate bonds, but not to high yield bonds.
Okay.
So the biggest risk that high yield bonds have is credit risk, which
Mm-hmm.
means, are they going to be able to pay back the loan,
Yep.
or are they going to, and pay back interest? That's the only thing you get when you invest in a bond,
Yeah.
right? And if you don't get paid back, then, you know, why invest in a bond? I mean, theoretically it's a loan, but it's really an investment, because it's, especially when it's a high yield bond,
Mm-hmm.
because you will get equity if the company can't pay back the debt, then you'll get equity or nothing.
It gets converted. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. So
Interesting.
yeah.
And this was an interesting time too, Liz, because you exited at the beginning of 2009 and the world was going nuts in 2008, right?
Mhm.
That
Well,
must have
both
been,
2008, 2009, because in
yeah.
2009 that's when the Dow went down to like 6,000 or something.
Yeah.
And so
Interesting.
now it's at 27.
It's crazy.
Yeah, so I could see we had a lot of so as our country ages,
Mm-hmm.
and as pension funds are trying to figure out how are they going to pay people with pensions, especially say in for civil servants,
Yep.
how are we going to pay these pensioners, and at the time, how was China going to maintain its currency?
Mm-hmm.
Because remember, China pretty much pegs its currency to the United States,
Yep. Yep.
to the U.S. dollar, in order to be like the preferred vendor to us.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so in order to do that, they needed all of these things need a lot of U.S. Based assets, because we're the biggest source of assets, tradable assets in the world.
Yeah, I
So
believe it.
our financial markets are super, um, they're the most liquid assets in the world, and most, quote unquote honest and defendable assets.
Yep.
Because the government can't take them away from people, like a lot, especially the emerging countries.
Yep. Yep.
So there was all this demand for debt.
Hmm.
So what happened is that it used to be, when I started, that debt was a company issued a loan,
Mm-hmm.
or a bond or stock. And, well, a company issued a loan or a bond, and that was it. Stock market already had the derivatives of, calls and puts,
Mm-hmm.
but that didn't exist in the bond market or the loan market
Okay.
until after 2000.
Okay.
So I remember first hearing about it. They called it CDS, credit default swap.
Mm-hmm.
So basically what it was saying is, I remember a salesperson come in and saying, okay, what it's doing, you're not going to own the asset, but it's going to provide you this ability to trade the risk of the asset.
Mm-hmm.
So it basically created speculation. And then also, instead of, if a company borrowed, let's say $500 million,
Mm-hmm.
and you have all these people they need the assets for their portfolios, because China's buying stuff, pension funds are buying stuff. There's not enough assets for all these people. So they started selling credit default swaps in order to get the same benefit from the bond.
Yep.
And believe it, I still don't really quite know how to explain it, but so as the demand grew, that's why all these crappy loans started.
Yep.
Wall Street was trying
Money
to
was flowing.
fulfill a demand. Yeah, and they
Yeah.
didn't. So I could see it. We could see it from where we were. I always kind of thought of myself as a surfer out on the waves. That, not that I surf, but you can see the waves before the people on the beach do.
Yep.
So I saw this coming, and like the whole thing with housing prices, I kept getting things across my desk that was saying, Well, housing prices have never changed since 1934. And so that's why all of this is going to work.
Hmm.
And meanwhile, I had my friends who were just everyday non-Wall Street folk talking about how there was this thing called the liar loan,
Hmm.
or,
Yeah.
or ninja
Yeah.
loan, no income,
Yeah.
no job, where people who were like a gardener and a house, lady would come in and say, oh, yeah, I make $100,000 a year.
Yeah.
And it's like, so, the system can only work if there has to be an integrity to the system. And I could also see how people who question the system would just be fired. And, it
Yeah.
wasn't, not at my firm because we didn't do mortgages,
Yeah.
but I could see how you just could not question certain things.
Oh, absolutely.
And
People
that,
were greedy. I mean, this was like, they saw an opportunity, they saw, an opening, and they went for it, and too many people went for it, and then we ended up with 2008.
yeah. So the benefit for me, not is how I made a decent amount of wealth was we sold what was called a closed-end fund.
Mm,
So we actually did several of them, but I did. I was on the road show, so I traveled around the country for one of them where we raised $3 billion.
mm-hmm,
And so what closed-end fund is, how do you put it? It's an asset that trades like a stock,
mm-hmm,
but the underlying asset is a bundle
mm-hmm,
of, how you were saying you bundled together
mm-hmm.
mortgages.
Yep.
This would be a bundle of high yield bonds,
Mm-hmm.
convertible bonds, some equity, and then we borrowed we borrowed something like 30% to lever it up.
Okay.
And so the fees on that were from $3 billion. Now I didn't get all the money,
Mm-hmm.
but it was 1% our management fee. So
Nice.
imagine like that being divided by about 8 people. It's
Mm-hmm.
a lot of money.
Yeah.
And but I thought about it and I was like, well, this is what people want, and it's really not that outrageous to lever something up
No.
30%. It's like
No.
having equity in a house, where
Yeah.
you lever
Yeah.
up. It's like
Yep.
a mortgage, but when you look at a lot of the hedge funds that were around, they were levered like 100 times
Mm-hmm.
because they would borrow money to buy credit default swaps, which
Yep.
were lottery tickets.
Yep. Yep.
And so I think when I finally left, it was, the one of those things where the straw just breaks the camel's back. It was
Mm-hmm.
just a lot of stuff. My brother was very sick and had been diagnosed with this dreadful disease called adrenomyeloneuropathy.
Mm.
And at the age of 52, he got dementia.
Mm.
And he really he was a lifelong Republican, and, which is just, the reason I say it is because, you talk about people who don't want to have a social safety net.
Mm-hmm.
And yet when he fell into this disease, which he never thought he would have, he had no social safety net. So all he
Yeah.
had was so there was that debacle. And then Prop 8 was around, where it was about marriage equality. So
Mm-hmm.
people in California could vote whether or not marriage was between a man and a woman.
Yep.
And so as a lesbian, that was, it was one of those like, I'm kind of tired of acting like you all have all the rights and I'm not allowed to have any rights.
Absolutely.
And so I talked to, I had a guy I worked with and told me he was going to vote yes on 8. And I about, self-combusted.
Socked him.
And, yeah, and it was just like, no. And then when I
Yeah.
looked around, going back to my diversity, how I was always really strong in diversity, and I looked around and how there were no people of color working with
Yeah.
us.
Yeah.
and that I was the only woman senior vice president.
Mm-hmm.
And and I just couldn't handle it anymore.
Yeah.
And I guess I know there were other things too, but as one woman who had left, she said she felt like she was a cat in a box,
Mm.
so that she wasn't allowed to do anything. Like she had all this energy, but because it was a male-dominated profession, she was not able to, contribute at the level she wanted to. And I was like, oh, okay, yeah, I get that, cat in a box.
Yeah.
And so one day, after 8 years of not having stellar reviews, I get this tap on the shoulder that, and this was a 2 weeks after I came back I had taken a 1 week of family leave to go see my brother.
Mm-hmm.
And another week I went to Mexico just to because I knew I just had this feeling that he was going to die.
Mm-hmm.
So I didn't pick up the phone to call in work. I was just like, this is really sucks.
Yeah.
And Prop 8 had passed, and I was just like grief stricken. So I get a tap on the shoulder, that I go into a room.
Mm.
And so I got this bad performance review.
Jeez.
And I walked out and I thought, I have a choice here. So I knew, and this is what anybody in a call would say, never sign anything. I don't care what people put in front of you. Just deny, anything.
Yep.
And to say, oh, I'll sign it later. And I'll say, no, sign it. And like, no, I have to think about it.
Yeah.
So I called my partner, Rose, and I said, I think it's time for me to quit. What do you think? And she says, yeah, that'd be great. And, when you work with that kind of money, because I was managing $1 billion on my own, which I thought was crazy. Like, why do I have to do this by myself? That's a lot of money to put in one person's hands, especially as the market was declining.
Yep.
So I just quit that day. And I remember just like, it was definitely one of those days that is sealed on my memory forever. And there was no, even a thought of it, that I was going to change my mind.
Yeah.
But boy, it took me a long time to still, get those voices out of my head of, just, Wall Street really, it's testosterone driven.
Oh, I can only imagine.
I hadn't realized how much that toxicity stayed in me as a woman.
Yeah.
But then, so I got through it. And then after that, I took a little while off. And then a friend of mine said, well, you do know a lot about money. Why don't you, because I was really mad at the world too, because of this whole 2008 and 9 debacle. And I'm like, how could this happen?
Yeah.
I'm like, all people want are things.
Yeah.
And what I realized over time, as, a friend told me, she's like, a lot about this. You should, it'd be great if you, stayed in at some point of helping people. And that's when I started Money Native. And that's when I also started more volunteering with SCORE. So to help small businesses understand their money. And I read this thing the other day that I thought was really interesting. It was called, it was about self-care. And it said, self-care isn't only about taking bubble baths. Sometimes self-care is sitting in front of a computer with a spreadsheet trying to figure out how you're going to pay down your debt, your credit card debt. And I think that's the same thing in a business, is that, the money part is so crucial, because it's water. It's like cash flow, that's why they call it liquidity.
Yep.
And so I guess I never thought, I was just steeped in it for so long. I mean, it was even from being a little girl, I used to count my father's petty cash drawer for his gas station. So I was always thinking about money from 5 years old.
Yeah.
So it is so hard for me to be in someone's shoes that doesn't think that way.
Yeah. I can understand that. Well, Liz, I want to ask a little more about SCORE. And so the rumor is, and you can correct me on this, but I believe SCORE, the acronym used to stand for Service Corps of Retired Executives. Is that accurate?
Senior Corps.
Senior Corps,
I
not
think,
Service Corps.
I
Senior
think
Corps.
so.
Okay, of retired executives. And I know they've gotten away from, relating that to the SCORE acronym. SCORE is such an important part of the fabric of small business, not only here in San Diego, but also nationally. Tell us just briefly, because I want to save a few minutes to talk about your business here. Tell us briefly about SCORE.
So SCORE just stands for SCORE, which cracks me up because I was thinking, try to Google SCORE and you might come up with some, triple X site.
Yes.
But, so it is a nonprofit resource arm of the Small Business Administration. And so the Small Business Administration basically does three things. They are supposed to provide capital to small businesses.
Mm-hmm.
Also government contracts, and the third is counseling.
Mm-hmm.
So SCORE falls into that category of counseling.
Mm-hmm.
And the benefit of SCORE over something like the I don't even know what it stands for, SBDC, Small Business Development
Center. Yep.
Okay. Is that people at SCORE have all had significant work experience in business. Mm-hmm. Now, when I joined SCORE, it was, very much still the senior core of retired executives, meaning that it was very homogeneous, male and white. Mm-hmm. And since 2014, a lot of changes have come through. Part of them is, me and other women in the organization standing up for our rights and, making changes. So now the way SCORE works is instead of going through extensive training, you can, and then becoming a mentor, now as a volunteer, you can be a subject matter expert, meaning like they call you just about like online marketing, and small mm-hmm. business needs help on online marketing. You could be a workshop presenter. So a lot of different things without having to put the same amount of time in. So that has opened it up for a lot of women and people of color, because not everybody is, a retired executive who has a ton of money. And I also think, pensions are going away. So a lot of people who retired and had a pension, they're able to volunteer full time. Yes. But a lot of people are working longer. But what I think the best thing about, instead of going into thinking it's about experts, it's about a network of mm-hmm. who can you call. The same thing, it kind of, for me, it extends my Hera Hub network. Yeah. Because right now what I do for SCORE is I am the MC of the Women's Networking Breakfast, mm-hmm. which is every other month. And the next mm-hmm. one is actually down in, what is it called? It's the Jacobs Innovation Center.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah. So it'll be going over, your elevator pitch, like a 30-second sizzler pitch. Yeah.
That's great.
But what I like about it is, getting women together and, designed for women.
Yep.
To talk about things, and it's taken a long time for the men in the organization to understand why something needs to be designed for women. They think it's, all lives matter.
Yes.
And, but I think it's just such a different way to walk in the world as a woman.
Yeah.
And I'm sure it's different, it's different to walk in the world as a lesbian. It's different to walk in the world as a person of color. Yeah. But so that's the thing with SCORE, is that I can think of like, oh, he or she does this, or, or Sally would know how to, Sally Broff, who's been the president, now she's the assistant district director. Mm-hmm. It's just the way she negotiates and asks questions. And I copy, I've never had a female mentor like that in the business world.
Hmm.
because Sally used to own her own business, two businesses, and she sold successfully.
That's awesome.
And I just love, how she'll say things to me like, I have to ask you this question, and it'll be like, will you be on the board? Or, and, and I'm like, no. And then, but she'll come back later and say, I have to ask you this question.
Very,
And I
very
think,
convincing.
yeah, and she says, she loves to say she comes from a long line of pushy Jews and Jewish women.
Yeah.
And, and she's become a lifelong friend.
Yeah.
And I can go to her in confidence and understand, both with my business and also helping other entrepreneurs, like the, the man behind the curtain, like all that stuff that nobody wants to talk about. You have to talk about it at some point.
Yeah.
Because, especially things like cash, because that's the lifeblood of your business.
It is.
And actually now I'm trying to work on something, and I was thinking about, who do I know? And I thought, someone at Hera Hub. So this was about like a new law that passed for independent contractors here in California.
Yes. Yes.
And so musicians are not able to be independent contractors anymore. They have to be employees at like a church.
Yeah.
So I was thinking, Tiffany would know that at Hera Hub.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the thing with SCORE is, they have, if you go to score.org, you can find a nice library of resources, and also a lot of online workshops.
Yeah.
And then locally here in San Diego, we have, you go to sandiego.score.org, and then they have a lot of workshops. And I think about, some of the workshops I've taken are really good. There's QuickBooks, LinkedIn. They did have one on Amazon selling that was super popular. Other ones I've taken is, what is it? Social media for the busy entrepreneur.
Love it.
And what it really helps me too with is staying connected is this like little web of small business resources here in San Diego. And I know you've tried to get people together more from like a consortium standpoint of like, okay, let's not all do the same thing here.
Yep, exactly.
And I think for a small business owner, it's hard to know how to navigate.
Yeah, it absolutely is. And speaking of navigation, I want to make sure we touch on your business before we sign off here. So really with Money Native, I know you have many tools in your toolkit, but what I really love your focus on is helping companies get their finances in order so they can be ready to perhaps get a loan or refinance a loan or, maybe bring on an investor. Touch on that briefly. Maybe give us one example, Liz, of a company that you've worked with to help them get to that point.
Yeah, sure. So I think in general, if I were to just tell everybody, the audience, is that, about finances, that strangers like winners. So if you're seeking any kind of finance, you need to look good. You need your financials to look good and actually real for either people who are going to borrow money or investors. So you don't want to go to anybody when you're, last in the race. And that goes back to what I was talking about earlier. Only the vulture investors are going to help you there, and they're not going to be pretty. So when you'll have more negotiating power, the better your business is. And so working on that. So right now I'm working with a guy who he wants to sell his business in 5 years. So he is working on different elements of, he's been in business for 15 years, and it's basically, I would say, a web publishing company.
Okay.
So he's been in business for 15 years, but he's never, it used to be his sister who did the QuickBooks, and now he's hired somebody. But then when I look at the QuickBooks, I was like, I don't know if anybody's going to, how are you going to use these numbers? And so we're working together to get them into, a good chart of accounts, and then have him look at, he's always left it to his bookkeeper to look at the cash.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're getting him to be focused on, okay, you have to look at the cash every week.
Mm-hmm.
And what's the outstanding, just little things like the invoices. What invoices are outstanding? And should you still have that on, why is that still on your balance sheet as a receivable if you're not going to be able to collect it?
Mm-hmm.
So it's just, you would think, like, going back to when I was talking about at Citibank, I would go out and collect, the invoices for the legal fees.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot in business of just the follow-up around money is really important.
Absolutely.
And do you know your credit score? And have you been doing things like that? So I just help people, provide them with, a safe place to talk about the stuff that they don't want to talk about. They don't want to admit to others they don't know.
Yeah.
But they do know that they have these goals to sell their business eventually.
Yeah.
Or make it an employee, even this business, in positioning it for sale. I've talked to some small business brokers, and a couple are like, I don't know if someone's going to want to buy a web publishing business, but maybe that would make sense as an employee-owned business where the employees buy it. And then he only has to have, minimum face time with the business over time.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because I'm sure the difficulty is actually that point where you can walk away from the business and it still functions.
Yes, exactly. And that's that's the goal for most, but quite hard to do for most business owners. So Liz, if somebody is interested in your support and around getting their financial house in order, and whether it's looking to get a loan or refinance or maybe take on an equity investor, what's the best way for them to find you?
Well, I do have a website that is getting revamped as we speak, but it's moneynative.com. Or you can email me at liz@moneynative, moneynative.com.
Perfect. Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing your story with us, Liz.
Sure. Thanks a lot, Selena. Have a good one.
Thank you for joining this week's episode of Flight Club, sponsored by Hera Hub. We look forward to sharing more success stories with you soon.